The room was already charged before Stephanie entered, thick with the kind of panic that never announces itself loudly but instead seeps into every breath, every pause, every unfinished sentence. Ridge, Brooke, Carter, and Steffi were not arguing. They were circling the same unspoken fear from different angles, each of them aware that something fundamental had shifted beneath their feet. Logan was no longer protected. The name that had once functioned as both shield and banner was now exposed, stripped of its institutional armor. Katie had not only seized the moment, but had claimed it with terrifying clarity, preparing to launch her own fashion house as if the idea had been waiting patiently for years, biding its time until the ground finally cracked. The threat was not abstract. It was immediate, structural, and deeply personal. This was not a rival brand rising somewhere across the city. This was family, legacy, history turning inward and threatening to consume itself. Ridge felt it as a pressure behind his eyes, the familiar sensation of control slipping away despite his best efforts to grip tighter. Brooke's unease manifested differently, surfacing as a restless energy that moved through her body even when she stood still. Carter, ever the strategist, was already calculating legal vulnerabilities, shareholder reactions, and the speed at which confidence could evaporate once doubt entered the bloodstream of a company. Steffi, however, experienced the moment with a sharper edge. For her, this was not just a crisis of branding or protection. It was confirmation that the structures she had relied upon, the assumptions she had built her authority on, were no longer stable. Logan's loss of protection was not a footnote. It was a wound, and it was bleeding fast. When Stephanie walked in, the effect was immediate and visceral. Conversation died not because anyone told it to, but because something older and heavier than fear had entered the room. Stephanie did not need to announce herself. Her presence carried its own gravity, a force shaped by decades of command, sacrifice, and unyielding will. She did not rush. She did not scan faces for reassurance or reaction. She simply took in the scene with the calm of someone who had seen far worse storms and had survived them all. In that moment, the panic in the room did not disappear, but it was reframed. This was no longer just a crisis. It was a reckoning. Stephanie understood instantly what was happening, not because she had been briefed, but because she recognized the signs. A family bleeding power always looks the same in its early stages. Too many voices, too many compromises, too much fear of offending the wrong person. She listened as the situation was laid out, as Katie's move was dissected and Logan's vulnerability was acknowledged in careful, almost clinical terms. Yet, even as they spoke, Stephanie's expression revealed that she was already operating several steps ahead. This was not news to her in the way they thought it was. It was confirmation of something she had long anticipated, perhaps even prepared for. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the room with a precision that left no space for interruption. She did not begin with strategy or reassurance. She did not offer comfort or nostalgia. Instead, she delivered a sentence so unexpected, so destabilizing, that it froze every thought mid-motion. "Dylan is my daughter." The words did not echo, they detonated. The silence that followed was not confusion, but shock so complete it bordered on disbelief. Every face in the room reflected a different version of the same realization. Nothing they thought they understood about the current landscape was complete. Stephanie did not pause to let the weight of the revelation settle gently. She allowed it to land hard because she understood that shock was sometimes the only way to cut through denial. Dylan's existence, her identity, her connection to Stephanie, rewrote more than family lines. It reframed loyalty, inheritance, and influence. This was not a sentimental confession. It was a strategic disclosure, timed precisely to destabilize the narrative already unraveling around them. Stephanie had not returned to reminisce or to observe from the sidelines. She had returned to intervene. The declaration that followed was just as merciless in its clarity. If Forrester was bleeding because of Logan, then her blood would be the thing to save it. The metaphor was not accidental. Stephanie was invoking lineage, sacrifice, and ownership in the same breath. She was reminding them that this company was not built on trends or collaborations alone, but on personal cost, on choices that demanded something in return. Yet she was equally clear that salvation would not come free. The price was power. Real power? Not symbolic influence or advisory roles, but control that returned decisively to her hands. Ridge reacted first, though his response was not verbal. His body tensed, his posture shifting instinctively into resistance. Stephanie's words struck at the core of his identity, challenging not just his authority, but his right to it. He had spent years navigating the balance between honoring her legacy and asserting his own leadership. To hear her speak of reclaiming power was to confront the possibility that his stewardship had failed in a way that could no longer be politely ignored. Brooke's reaction was more internal, a complex mix of shock, betrayal, and dawning realization. The revelation about Dylan did not merely surprise her. It unsettled her understanding of Stephanie herself, forcing her to reconsider what else might have been withheld. What other truths might still be waiting in the shadows? Carter's mind raced, not with emotion but with consequence. Stephanie's return altered the legal landscape instantly. Authority structures, governance documents, and decision-making hierarchies would all need to be reassessed. Her demand for power was not symbolic. It implied a restructuring that could override agreements and understandings painstakingly built over years. Yet Carter also recognized the brutal logic of her argument. Katie's move proved that vulnerability had already been exposed. In times like these, diffuse authority often meant slow death. Centralized power, while dangerous, could also be decisive. Steffi stood at the intersection of all these reactions, her internal conflict sharper and more complex than any of theirs. Stephanie was not just a founder or a legend to her. She was the embodiment of uncompromising leadership, the standard against which every generation had been measured. Hearing Stephanie frame herself as the solution forced Steffi to confront a painful question. Had her own efforts, her own attempts to modernize and protect, been insufficient? The implication was not subtle. Stephanie was saying that the current leadership had allowed Forrester to bleed, and that only a return to her kind of authority could stop it. Stephanie did not soften her stance. She spoke of Logan not with bitterness, but with surgical assessment. Protection had bred complacency. Familiar alliances had dulled urgency. Katie's decision to break away was not treachery. It was opportunity seized in a moment of weakness. Stephanie did not condemn Katie for it. In fact, there was almost a trace of respect in how she acknowledged the move. What she condemned was the environment that allowed such a move to become possible. That environment, she made clear, would end under her watch. The revelation about Dylan lingered in the room like a second, quieter storm. Questions pressed against the edges of every mind, but none were voiced. Stephanie's message was unmistakable. Dylan was not merely family. She was leverage, legacy, and proof that Stephanie's connection to the future of Forrester was not symbolic, but biological. This was not about sentiment. It was about continuity on Stephanie's terms. By revealing Dylan's identity now, Stephanie was anchoring her claim not just in the past she had built, but in a future she still intended to shape. The tension that followed was not explosive, but coiled. Ridge understood that outright refusal would fracture the company further. Brooke understood that siding with Stephanie would mean surrendering influence she had fought to protect. Carter understood that compromise might satisfy no one. Steffi understood that this moment would define her leadership more than any decision she had made so far. Stephanie watched them all with the patience of someone who knew that time, in this instance, was her ally. Forrester was bleeding. Panic had already taken hold. In moments like these, the promise of certainty, even at a high cost, was seductive. Stephanie's final words were not a threat, but they carried the weight of inevitability. She was not asking to be restored. She was offering to take responsibility. The distinction mattered to her, even if it unsettled everyone else. Responsibility, in her vocabulary, meant authority matched with consequence. It meant decisions made without consensus when consensus became a liability. It meant accepting blame as readily as credit. She was willing to bleed for Forrester because she believed she had already done so, again and again, long before anyone else understood what that cost. As the meeting ended, nothing was resolved, yet everything had changed. Katie's fashion house loomed larger now, not just as competition, but as proof that the old protections were gone. Logan's vulnerability was no longer theoretical, and Stephanie's return had transformed panic into a different, more dangerous energy, the tension between salvation and surrender. Each person left the room carrying a different burden, aware that the next choice they made would either cement Stephanie's return to power or plunge Forrester into a battle it might not survive. Stephanie remained behind for a moment, alone with the legacy she had both built and fractured. She knew the cost of what she had demanded. She knew that reclaiming power would make her the villain in some narratives, the savior in others. But she also knew something else, something the others were only beginning to grasp. In times of crisis, Forrester did not need comfort or compromise. It needed blood, iron, and the kind of leadership that did not flinch at the price. And Stephanie was prepared to pay it, even if it meant taking everything back. The bold and the beautiful has never shied away from transforming family secrets into weapons, but this chapter marks a turning point where truth itself becomes infrastructure, and blood becomes leverage. Stephanie's return does not unfold as a nostalgic resurrection or a sentimental reckoning. It arrives with documents, signatures, and a precision that leaves no room for doubt. The DNA test is not waved theatrically or hinted at through implication. It is presented cleanly, legally airtight, verified beyond challenge. In a world where truth is often negotiated or delayed, this truth lands with brutal clarity. Dylan is Stephanie's biological daughter. There is no ambiguity left to soften the blow, no space to retreat into denial. Yet the most profound shock does not ripple through the boardroom or the family elders first. It strikes Dylan herself, freezing her in place because this truth arrives at the worst possible moment of her life. Dylan has already been living under suspicion long before Stephanie speaks her name. Her recent history has made her a lightning rod for doubt, rumor, and projection. The chaos surrounding Luna dragged her into a web of insinuations that never fully unraveled, leaving her reputation bruised even when facts failed to condemn her. Being taken in by Will and Elektra, though generous and stabilizing on the surface, only deepened the sense that Dylan was a figure being moved across other people's chessboards. She did not choose to become the center of speculation, nor did she seek refuge as a dependent. Each event layered another question onto her identity. Who is she, really, and who gets to define her when she does not yet feel anchored in her own life? So when Stephanie presents the DNA results, Dylan does not feel relief or validation. She feels exposed. Her body reacts before her mind can process the implications. The truth that others might celebrate as belonging, legacy, or elevation feels to Dylan like another trap, another narrative she is expected to step into for the sake of someone else's agenda. The timing is cruel. The world has just finished doubting her, and now it is ready to claim her, loudly and publicly, not as herself but as a symbol. The idea that her identity could be weaponized in a corporate war makes her recoil instinctively. Dylan has no desire to become the lost daughter resurrected to legitimize a coup at Forrester. Blood may be fact, but fact does not automatically translate into home. Stephanie, however, has not returned to ask Dylan how she feels about destiny. She understands resistance. She even anticipates it. That is why she comes armed not just with biology, but with history. When she reveals the existence of an old will and trust, meticulously constructed and legally dormant for years, the room shifts again. This is not improvisation. This is activation. The documents confirm that Dylan does not merely carry Stephanie's blood. She carries a fragment of voting power that has been deliberately concealed. buried under layers of management decisions and quiet legal maneuvering. Someone ensured that this piece of authority never surfaced, never complicated the balance of power. Stephanie's return is not about reclaiming what was taken from her. It is about turning the key on power that was always there, waiting. For Dylan, this revelation lands even harder than the DNA. Suddenly, she is not just a daughter, she is a switch, a conduit, a mechanism through which dormant authority can surge back to life. The realization terrifies her because it confirms her worst fear, that her personhood is secondary to her utility. Stephanie speaks of rights, votes, and influence with clarity and conviction, framing Dylan's role as both inevitable and necessary. Yet Dylan hears something else beneath the words. She hears expectation, obligation, a future that has already been drafted without her consent. The conflict between them is not loud or explosive. It is quiet, taut, and emotionally raw. Dylan does not reject Stephanie outright because the truth is undeniable and the connection undeniable as well. There is a pull there, something deep and disorienting, the biological recognition that cannot be reasoned away. But Dylan also knows that accepting Stephanie as her mother does not automatically mean surrendering herself as a tool. The question that haunts her is simple and devastating. Can a biological truth coexist with autonomy, or will one always consume the other? Is a mother the same thing as a home, especially when that mother arrives carrying a war? Stephanie, for her part, is not blind to Dylan's fear. She simply prioritizes differently. She has lived long enough to understand that power unused is power wasted, and that sentimentality has never saved Forrester when it truly mattered. She does not frame Dylan's role as exploitation, but as inheritance. In her worldview, legacy is not something one opts out of without consequence. She believes she is offering Dylan not a burden, but agency, even if that agency arrives wrapped in conflict. The tragedy is that Stephanie's definition of agency is shaped by decades of battle, while Dylan's definition is shaped by a lifetime of being pulled into storms she did not create. As this internal struggle unfolds, the external battlefield grows more brutal by the hour. Katie's strategy to rebuild Logan as a direct competitor accelerates with ruthless efficiency. Recruiting Deke is not a symbolic gesture, it is a calculated strike. Deke brings not just talent, but institutional memory, understanding the rhythms of Forrester design cycles, the strengths of its supply chains, and the vulnerabilities that come with scale. Katie is not interested in coexistence. She is building an entity designed to wound, to siphon relevance, and to expose the complacency that protection once allowed to fester. Stephanie responds not with counter-marketing or public spectacle, but with infrastructure warfare. Using Dylan's newly activated voting power, she begins to lock down the arteries that feed both sides of the industry. Design pipelines tighten, fabric contracts are renegotiated or frozen, factory access becomes conditional. The moves are legal, precise, and devastating. What once looked like a brand rivalry transforms into a fight for survival, where delays mean missed seasons and missed seasons mean irrelevance. This is not about Logos anymore. It is about oxygen. Dylan watches this escalation with mounting dread. Each decisive action taken in her name feels like a step further away from the life she was trying to build, the quiet stability she sought after chaos. She understands intellectually that Stephanie's strategy is brilliant. Emotionally, it feels like being conscripted. The irony is painful. The power that could make her untouchable is the same power stripping away her choice. She finds herself longing not for answers, but for permission to exist outside the roles others assign her. The weight of being both key and collateral presses down on her until she can barely breathe. Stephanie's resolve does not waver. She sees the industry for what it is, unforgiving, cyclical, and ruthless to those who hesitate. In her mind, Dylan's discomfort is temporary, a necessary growing pain on the path to understanding what it means to carry a legacy worth defending. She believes that once Dylan sees the stakes clearly, she will stop resisting and start claiming what is hers. What Stephanie underestimates is the depth of Dylan's refusal to be owned by any narrative, even one written in blood. As the battle lines harden, every relationship begins to strain. Trust erodes. Alliances become conditional. The question is no longer who is right, but who will endure. Dylan stands at the center of this storm, the axis on which power turns, knowing that whatever choice she makes will define her forever. To step fully into Stephanie's world is to accept a life of constant conflict and strategic sacrifice. To step away is to risk being remembered as the one who let power slip back into shadow. This is the cruel brilliance of the moment. There is no clean escape. Mother is truth, but home remains uncertain. Power is real, but belonging is fragile. As Forrester and Logan circle each other like wounded giants, and as Stephanie tightens her grip on the mechanisms that decide who survives and who fades, Dylan is forced to confront the most dangerous realization of all. In this world, neutrality is an illusion. Whether she claims the legacy or rejects it, the war will mark her. And in the bold and the beautiful, it is always the ones who never wanted the crown who feel its weight most crushingly once it is placed upon their heads.